one of the touchiest subjects that anyone can mention right now. This was the cause of the BLM riots that burned down the country. This was the cause of so much rancor last year. The George Floyd case. Now the George Floyd case has gone to trial. Former officer Derek Chauvin is on trial. Did he murder George Floyd? Did he accidentally kill George Floyd? Did George Floyd die of a drug overdose? What is going on in the trial right now? We are actually getting some breaking news that apparently the judge just abruptly excused the jury, is going on recess for the weekend. But someone with greater expertise on this subject than I can help weigh in. Brandon Tatum, former police officer, co-founder of Blexit, and author of Beaten Black and Blue, Being a Black Cop in an America Under Siege. Brandon, thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So, Brandon, what am I supposed to know about this case? You've got this unique perspective here. We always hear the racial aspect of the case. We rarely hear the cop aspect of the case. How does it stand, and is this guy going to the clink?
Well, I think that I'm satisfied to say that this is not going to be tried based on race. There's no charge of hate crime involved. So Chauvin is not going to be on trial because he was a racist white man who killed George Floyd in cold blood. That's not going to be what's going to be heard to the jury's not going to hear that, and defense and prosecution is not going to argue that. So the things that we need to know, and kind of like you said in the very beginning, is did the actions of Officer Chauvin cause the death, either intentionally cause the death or through negligence cause the death of George Floyd? And with the information that has come out more recently, the defense is really painting the picture of George Floyd being a drug user, habitual crime committer, a habitual liar when he's taken into custody, claiming he can't breathe, claiming he wants his mom. All of those cues that people were so upset about, they're proving to a certain degree that this is normal behavior and that the police officers may not have been able to diagnose his distress based on some of those factors.
So I've seen some headlines so far about the witnesses that the defense is calling and some of the claims of the drug use and possible overdoses. How convincing is it? These are things that we really hadn't heard all that much about before the trial. How much is this going to sway things?
Yeah, I think the jury would be incredibly convinced that this is not a man who's turning his life around and he was somehow under the knee of a police officer getting killed for 8 minutes. They're painting the picture of who George Floyd really was and how police were responding to him. What were they thinking? It kind of, points to the mental state of officers and the mental state of George Floyd when they spoke about him being on drugs, because this is going to be a huge factor, is did he die from the methamphetamine and fentanyl that he put into his system, which were above lethal amounts. I think it was 3 to 4 times the lethal dosage of any of those drugs. So that's going to be on trial, but the jury has an opportunity to see his behavior, his mannerisms, the drugs that he used, the effect that it had on him, and also the mannerisms of, Officer Chauvin and the other officers before he requested them put him on the ground and claiming that he couldn't breathe even when he was in the back of the police car. So them being able to see the full spectrum, the totality of circumstances, I believe it gives them a more balanced way to move forward in this trial.
But Brandon, I'm reliably informed by the mainstream media that this trial is not about Derek Chauvin. It's not about what he did. It's not even about George Floyd. It is a national reckoning on race. And so we have to ignore all the evidence of the trial, and we just need to think about slavery and Jim Crow and all redlining, whatever, anything not to talk about the actual facts on the ground here. Do you think that narrative is going to be successful?
Yeah, I think the narrative is going to be successful. I will say this right now, that no matter what happens in this trial, there's going to be riots, there's going to be protests, there's going to be burning of buildings, there's going to be people looting and buying and stealing Jordans out of the store as if it had anything to do with George Floyd. There's going to be a narrative that precedes this, for the rest of history. That is the goal by the mainstream media, politicians. They don't care about George Floyd's life. They don't care about Officer Chauvin's life or the other officers on scene. They could care less. This is an opportunity for them to get money through ratings. This is an opportunity for politicians to get reelected by pushing a false narrative of racism in this country. And I hope that people will be able to see through the mud and say that, this has nothing to do with race. This has everything to do with an encounter of a police officer and a man who was high on methamphetamine and fentanyl that went tragic. And I hope that people can see through, listen to the trial yourself. It's available online. You can go and watch every day of it. Watch the trial, listen to the defense argument, listen to the prosecution, listen to the witnesses, and then draw a conclusion, which will be the conclusion of the jury. Don't rely solely on media input because they're biased and they have an agenda.
So much of what the left is saying is that you, meaning the white man broadly, you white man could never understand what is going on here because you do not have the lived experience of a black man in America. So really, whatever you think you saw on video, that's not the whole story. There are all these implicit and subtle things going on, and we hear that all the time. What about the other side of this, though? The cop perspective that I was never a police officer. I really don't know what it's like to be a cop. This is an area that you certainly have some experience in. What is that dynamic like that maybe civilians don't quite understand?
Well, it's very incredibly, complex to be a police officer, and especially now in America. People have no idea about policing. Even people who support the police have no idea about policing. No fault of their own. It's impossible to know unless you're on the street with the uniform. You can smell, you hear the patrol car, you get that fear, that adrenaline runs through your body when it's life and death situations that you deal with every day. Seeing people, in very bad conditions, having to notify next of kin that the family members are never coming home. Those emotions, that adrenaline, that experience can never be replicated, can never be produced in a book. You have to actually be there. And I think that a lot of people have no idea about policing, which makes them, prejudiced in their judgment when they see police officers use force against people or have to take people's lives by use of deadly force. And one thing that I think could mitigate that, and I would encourage everybody, unless you're a convicted felon and you can't do this, but I would like for everybody to try to attempt to do a ride along. When the COVID is over, I call it the COVID, do a ride along with a police officer because you'll see firsthand how they do traffic stops. Can you see the race of a person in a car, even in broad daylight when you're pulling somebody over? How do you feel as a citizen standing by in the passenger seat while an officer is pursuing somebody, while an officer is engaging in a combative suspect? How do you feel? And then you can only imagine what it's like to have to get out of the car. And I'll tell you this real quick story. I remember I took a lady on a ride along. She was a social justice warrior. Her child and my child went to the same daycare. And I said, come do a ride along with me. She was so terrified. Really? That she wouldn't even get out of the car on a traffic stop. I'm talking about a person getting a speeding ticket. She refused to get out of the car. She stayed in the car. She was afraid. She was terrified. And at the end of the day, I was able to convince her that, see, you know nothing about policing and you may want to think twice before you misjudge them.
This is such an important point because I actually sometimes when people bring up, usually it's liberals, bringing up all these hidden aspects of racial and sexual relations, I give it a little bit of credence in that I think, well, yeah, maybe there's many experiences that I haven't had. Their culture matters a great deal. So, okay, I'm sort of interested in that. But shouldn't we have that same humility when we're talking about cops? Cops are doing a very technical job that you have to train to do that requires an immense amount of focus and discipline. And just like I would never try to tell a biologist how to do his job. I would never tell a carpenter how to do his job. I might be interested. I might oversee these things. I might try to study up on it, but I wouldn't just start spouting off. Likewise, don't you think we need to give a little bit of grace to cops?
Yeah, honestly, I think that this should be a curriculum in the grade school is for people to understand policing in America and from a impartial basis, meaning having a police officer. I remember when I was young, they used to have DARE and all this stuff and teaching people about obeying the laws. And they need to have police officers come to the classroom and talk to young children and explain to them, well, I'm a resource for you to call. When you call, this is what happens. This is my job. So children can grow up understanding the truth from police officers. And I'll say this because this is the biggest misconception, and I still don't understand how people get to this conclusion, is that law enforcement is racist. Like, I think the profession of law enforcement is probably the least racist profession in America. And why do you say this, Mr. Tatum? It's because we are not concerned about your race. We get exposed to great people of all races and also terrible people of all races. We are trained, we are surviving on character and not race at all. And so I wish people would understand that. Also, police patrol in jurisdictions, they don't just log in one day and go to the black community and harass black people.
Yeah.
Like there's a precinct in that community, and you only police in that precinct. And if you police on the north side, you would never interact with these people on the south side. So it's not some big police department that's conspiring against the black community. So I wish that people would understand that. Doing a ride along, listening to police officers actually speak on these topics would be the best form of education.
I love this education component too, because there was a time not so long ago in America when students were taught civics. Now students are taught sort of anti-civics, but they're taught their country is awful and their system of laws are unjust. But when you're learning about civics, you really ought to learn about the whole country, all the way up to the president and the structure of government and the Constitution, but all the way down to how that system of justice and laws are enforced, all the way down to the police officers who are actually doing the day-to-day work on the streets. It probably would increase our understanding and our healing and our compassion, whatever words that the left uses that they never seem to really believe in. Now, I agree that's the way things should work. Do you have any hope? You spend a lot of time in politics. Obviously, you've spent time as a police officer. Do you have any hope that that's actually what's going to happen, or not so much?
Well, I think in increments, in isolated situations. I think overall, we're doomed because we've allowed, Biden to become the president of the United States of America, and that his administration and all of these people are going to ram unjustifiable legislation down our throats. And if we would have taken that position, we should have done the same thing to them. We drug our feet when we had the House, the Senate, and the president. So with him in place, they're going to ram some things down our throats that's irreversible. However, individuals like you and I on small scales can educate people and inspire them to be informed on their own. Some schools are going to adopt this principle. Some universities will adopt this principle, meaning some professors. And with Turning Point and PragerU and all of these other organizations that are out doing the nonprofit work are going to help. And I failed to mention Blexit as well, are going to help people wake up who are willing. Everybody's not going to want to learn the truth. Everybody's not going to want to be informed as a free individual. But for those who want it, the opportunities will present themselves in a greater way in the future.
I have to say, I appreciate your characteristic bluntness when you say we are doomed. It reminds me of the liberal economist, John Maynard Keynes, who says, in the long run, we're all dead. That's true. But hopefully, I think you're right. I mean, there's a very conservative principle that gradually, you can make incremental change, especially in your local community, in your family. I mean, I love that story you tell about bringing some crazy social justice warrior that you knew because of your kid's preschool, bringing her on a ride along because you could actually show her something that really you can't quite do through a podcast or through a speech, maybe occasionally, but that personal interaction is going to be really, really important. And everybody has the ability to do that, no matter how crazy things get. And I think you're absolutely right. I think things are going to get a whole lot crazier. Brandon, where can people find you?
TheOfficerTatum.com, TheOfficerTatum, TheOfficerTatum.com. You can find everything I do, whether it's social media, whether it's my store, whether it's my website, all of those things will be at that one spot.
Not a Officer Tatum. There is only one. There is only the Officer Tatum. Go check out Brandon there. Thank you, sir. I really appreciate it. It really helped, I think, shed a lot of light on something where the left wants to keep their narrative as the only narrative. Brandon Tatum.